The hunting dogs were howling at midnight, their savage cries tearing through the Louisiana bayou like broken glass scraping against iron. This is the story of how one woman's silent fury became an overseer's slow demise. Fed, piece by piece, to animals that couldn't tell the difference between thrown scraps and human flesh. The fog rolled thick across Blackwater Estate on August 3, 1852, carrying the copper scent of blood and the damp rot of swamp water. What the plantation dogs consumed over 7 nights would make even the hardest men in St. Mary Parish lose their stomachs. Fragments of bone, strips of cloth, a silver flask still engraved with initials that no longer belonged to anyone living. Someone had been feeding Overseer Edmund Pike to his own pack, one carefully carved piece at a time. And the woman who'd done it was still walking free among 40 souls who knew exactly what happened but would never speak a word. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The kennel master found the first piece on August 10, 1852, wedged between the wooden slats of the dog run, where Edmund Pike's prized hunting pack slept in restless clusters. A brass button, tarnished but unmistakable, bearing the ornate P that Pike had commissioned from a New Orleans metalsmith just 6 months prior. The dogs circled the kennel master's boots with unusual agitation, their muzzles stained dark with something that wasn't their usual evening meal of cornmeal mush and table scraps. James Corbett had managed the kennels at Blackwater Estate for 12 years, long enough to recognize when his animals had tasted something they shouldn't have. The hunting dogs moved with the satisfied lethargy of creatures who'd gorged themselves, their bellies distended despite receiving only half rations the previous evening. The morning air hung thick with Louisiana humidity, carrying the mineral smell of swamp water, and something else underneath, something that made Corbett's hands shake as he examined the brass button more closely. Pike had been missing for 7 days, 7 nights of unexplained absence from a man whose routines were as predictable as the tides that rolled through the bayou channels surrounding St. Mary Parish. The overseer took his evening inspection of the property at exactly 9 o'clock every night, walking the same path between the slave quarters and the main house, checking locks and counting heads with the mechanical precision of a man who trusted nothing to chance or human reliability. But on August 3rd, Edmund Pike had vanished somewhere between the cotton storage barn and the big house. His lantern was found the next morning, still burning beside the path, its oil reservoir half full. His leather riding crop lay in the mud 10 feet away, as if dropped rather than set down deliberately. The dogs had been barking that night, their voices carrying across the estate with unusual intensity, but plantation dogs always barked at something. Shadows or possums or their own reflections in standing water. Master Nathaniel Ashford had ordered a search that covered every acre of Blackwater's 3,000 holdings. They dragged the bayou channels, searched the abandoned slave quarters on the eastern boundary, questioned every worker with the kind of aggressive interrogation that left several field hands nursing fresh wounds. Nothing. Pike had simply disappeared into the thick August night as if the swamp itself had swallowed him whole. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear has been buried in parish records for over a century, hidden beneath layers of official silence and deliberately falsified documentation. Corbett stumbled backward from the kennel, his mind racing through possibilities that made his breakfast threaten to resurface. The dogs hadn't killed Pike, they were trained too well for that, conditioned to attack only on command or when defending property from genuine threats. But they'd consumed something. Multiple somethings, judging by the scattered evidence now becoming visible in the early morning light, filtering through cypress branches that surrounded the kennel compound. A scrap of fabric, dark wool that matched Pike's preferred evening coat, a fragment of bone, picked clean and gnawed at the ends. The silver flask that Pike carried everywhere, dented now and bearing tooth marks along its engraved surface. The dogs had been fed systematically over multiple nights, given portions small enough to consume completely but substantial enough to satisfy their predatory appetites. The field hands were already assembling for morning roll call, their faces carefully neutral as they watched Corbett's obvious distress unfold in real time. They stood in organized rows between the whitewashed slave quarters and the cotton barns, 40 souls whose expressions revealed nothing about the overseer's disappearance or the evidence scattered throughout the kennel where plantation dogs had spent the past week consuming something that used to give orders and wield a whip with calculated cruelty. But one face was missing from the usual assembly. Talise Corvain, the house servant who had worked in the kitchen for 8 years, wasn't standing in her customary position near the front. The space where she usually waited with downcast eyes and folded hands remained conspicuously empty, creating a gap in the formation that drew attention despite everyone's efforts to pretend they noticed nothing unusual. Corbett's hand found the pistol at his belt as he scanned the assembled workers, his voice cutting through the morning humidity with sharp-edged panic. "Where's Talisa?" The silence stretched like rope pulled taut between opposing forces. Spanish moss swayed from ancient live oaks that had witnessed decades of suffering, their gnarled branches heavy with moisture and secrets that would never be spoken aloud. In the distance, a heron called across the bayou channels while the real witnesses stood mute, protecting knowledge that could get them all sold downriver or worse. Old Benjamin, the eldest field hand whose weathered face had seen 50 years of plantation life, finally spoke with the practiced deference of someone who'd survived by knowing exactly what to reveal and what to bury. "Ain't seen her since yesterday evening, sir. Figured she was tending to her stomach ailment. Been poorly for near about a week now." The lie fell smooth as bayou water from lips that had perfected the art of strategic truth-telling. These people had survived by becoming invisible, by developing an instinct for what overseers wanted to hear versus what actually happened in the spaces between official observation and documented reality. But Corbett caught something in their collective stillness, a quality of attention that suggested they knew considerably more than their carefully neutral expressions would ever reveal. Blood feeds the earth here in Louisiana, soaking into soil that had absorbed generations of suffering. What had really happened during those 7 dark nights between Pike's disappearance and the discovery of brass buttons and dog excrement? How does a man simply vanish, leaving only fragments and the satisfied appetite of animals he'd trained to hunt runaway slaves through swamp channels that could swallow evidence as completely as quicksand? The answers lay hidden in the quarters, whispered between people who'd learned that survival meant swallowing truth until it poisoned you from within, until the pressure built to levels that demanded release through actions that could never be undone or forgiven by the system that created the need for such desperate measures. But Talise wasn't the only thing missing from morning roll call at Blackwater Estate. Pike's skinning knife, the one he used for field dressing deer during hunting season, was gone from the kennel storage room. The meat cleaver from the kitchen house had vanished from its usual hook beside the fireplace. Someone had come prepared for work that required specific tools, implements designed to reduce large animals into manageable portions that could be distributed over multiple feedings without overwhelming the dogs. Digestive capacity. The real question wasn't who had done this terrible thing. It was how long they'd been planning it, and whether Edmund Pike would be the only overseer to disappear into the bellies of plantation dogs that knew no difference between the meat thrown to them and the man who'd commanded their loyalty through fear and systematic brutality. The morning mist clung to Blackwater Estate like a burial shroud, transforming the Louisiana landscape into something from a fever dream. The plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of rich bottomland along the Atchafalaya Basin, where cotton grew in soil fertilized by centuries of flooding and more recent applications of human suffering, measured in whip scars and unmarked graves. Master Nathaniel Ashford had inherited the property from his father in 1847, along with 63 enslaved people whose market value exceeded the worth of the land itself. He'd immediately hired Edmund Pike as overseer, bringing in a man whose reputation for extracting maximum productivity through strategic cruelty had been established across 3 parishes and a dozen previous positions. Pike had come from a failed plantation near Baton Rouge, where his previous employer had gone bankrupt despite record cotton yields. Some whispered that Pike's methods were too harsh, that he broke workers faster than they could be replaced, that his approach to discipline crossed lines that even other overseers found excessive. But Ashford valued results over methodology, and Pike delivered results with mathematical precision. Under Pike's management, Blackwater's cotton production had increased 40% in 5 years. The numbers looked excellent in Ashford's ledgers, neat columns of profit that justified every decision and validated every technique employed to achieve those margins. What the ledgers didn't record were the screams that echoed from the whipping post on Tuesday mornings, or the pregnancies that ended in miscarriage after women were forced back to fieldwork too soon, or the way children learned to recognize Pike's footsteps and scatter like startled birds. The estate operated on routines as rigid as military discipline. Morning roll call at dawn, fieldwork until noon, a brief rest during the worst heat, then back to the cotton rows until sunset made picking impossible. Evening inspections at 9 o'clock sharp, when Pike would walk his circuit with lantern and ledger, counting heads and checking quarters for any sign of forbidden activity, unauthorized gatherings, or the kind of rest that might indicate workers weren't sufficiently exhausted by their daily labor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The big house stood at the property center, a Greek revival mansion that Ashford had expanded with profits from his first successful harvest. White columns rose 2 stories, supporting a gallery where the master could survey his domain while sipping imported whiskey and calculating the market value of human beings whose names he rarely bothered to learn. The architecture spoke of civilization and culture, completely disconnected from the reality of how that civilization was built and maintained. Between the big house and the slave quarters stretched a quarter-mile of manicured grounds, gardens tended by house servants who understood that every flower represented hours of labor stolen from rest or family time. The kitchen house sat separate from the main residence, connected by a covered walkway that allowed servants to transport meals without being seen by dinner guests, who preferred not to think about the hands that prepared their food. The slave quarters formed 2 parallel rows of wooden cabins, each structure housing anywhere from 6 to 12 people in spaces designed for half that number. The buildings had been whitewashed recently, giving them a deceptively clean appearance that disguised the reality of dirt floors, leaking roofs, and walls so thin that privacy was a concept rather than an actual possibility. Between the cabin rows ran a packed earth street where children played games that prepared them for lives they hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. Beyond the quarters stood the working buildings of a functioning plantation, cotton barns for storing harvested crops, a gin house where mechanical presses separated fibers from seeds, blacksmith shop, carpentry shed, smokehouse, storage facilities for tools and supplies. Each building represented a piece of the economic machinery that converted human labor into commodities traded on markets hundreds of miles away. The kennels occupied the eastern edge of the estate, positioned to intercept anyone attempting to flee toward the bayou channels that offered theoretical escape routes through swampland that killed as efficiently as any overseer's bullet. Pike kept 12 hunting dogs, a mixed pack of bloodhounds and curs trained to track human scent through water and over distances that made running away an exercise in postponing the inevitable rather than achieving actual freedom. Those dogs had been Pike's pride, animals he treated with more consideration than he showed the people he supervised. They received regular meals, medical attention when injured, and housing that exceeded the quarters provided for field hands. Pike had trained them personally, teaching them to follow scent trails, to corner rather than kill, to hold position until their master arrived to handle the actual punishment of recaptured runaways. The irony of those dogs consuming their trainer piece by piece over 7 careful nights would have amused Pike if he'd possessed the capacity for self-reflection or appreciation of poetic justice. But Edmund Pike had never been a reflective man. He'd been a functionary, someone who executed assigned tasks with brutal efficiency and never questioned whether those tasks aligned with any moral framework beyond the economic imperatives of plantation agriculture. From the Journal of Dr. Marcus Tharvin, Parish Physician, August 11, 1852. Called to examine remains found at Blackwater Estate. Nature of Fragments suggests systematic reduction by trained animals. Cannot definitively identify human origin, but circumstantial evidence points to disturbing conclusions that parish authorities may prefer not to investigate too closely. The discovery of evidence in the kennels had created problems that extended beyond simple criminal investigation. If Pike had indeed been murdered and fed to dogs, then someone on the plantation possessed both the knowledge and determination necessary to execute such an elaborate plan. That implied intelligence, strategic thinking, and patience, qualities that the entire plantation system depended on enslaved people supposedly not possessing. Acknowledging that a slave had planned and executed Pike's murder would require acknowledging that enslaved people were capable of complex reasoning and long-term planning. That acknowledgement would undermine every justification for the system itself, every argument about natural hierarchy and childlike dependency that allowed men like Ashford to sleep comfortably while profiting from human bondage. Better to call it an accident, a disappearance, maybe even a runaway overseer who'd abandoned his post. Anything except the truth that Pike had been methodically butchered and disposed of by someone he'd brutalized once too often, someone who'd finally reached the breaking point where survival required elimination of the threat rather than continued submission to it. The plantation bell rang out across Blackwater Estate, its iron voice calling workers to their assigned tasks. The sound carried across cotton fields, still wet with morning dew, across the bayou channels where alligators dozed in shallow water, across the kennels where hunting dogs slept off their week of unusual feasting. Life would continue at Blackwater as it always had, with or without Edmund Pike to enforce the routines that kept everything functioning according to Nathaniel Ashford's profit calculations. But something had changed in the space between Pike's disappearance and the discovery of brass buttons in dog waste. The 40 souls who assembled for morning roll call carried knowledge that transformed their relationship to the system that enslaved them. They'd learned that overseers were mortal, that revenge was possible, that some forms of justice existed outside any legal framework designed to protect property rights over human dignity. That knowledge would spread like fire through dry grass, whispered between workers in moments stolen from supervision, coded into songs that sounded like spirituals but carried revolutionary messages to those who understood their true meaning. Pike's death had planted seeds that would grow in ways nobody at Blackwater Estate could predict or control. Tullis Corvain's back bore 19 scars from previous whippings, each one a testament to Edmund Pike's systematic approach to discipline and his belief that pain was the most effective teacher. The pattern of raised tissue formed a map of her 8 years at Blackwater Estate, marking offenses both real and imagined, moments when she'd failed to meet expectations that shifted according to Pike's mood and the amount of whiskey he'd consumed the previous evening. She lay now in the sweltering heat of the quarters, supposedly recovering from stomach ailment that old Benjamin had diplomatically reported to the kennel master. The rough texture of her cornshuck mattress pressed against her fevered skin while flies buzzed through cracks in the cabin walls. This is how transformation begins. Not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet suffering that accumulates until the vessel can hold no more, and must either shatter or evolve into something harder. Talise had been purchased at auction in New Orleans 8 years ago, bought along with her mother and younger brother from an estate sale after their previous owner died of yellow fever. She'd been 17 then, young enough to hope that perhaps this new situation might be better than the last. Naive enough to believe that plantation life contained gradations of suffering, rather than just different flavors of the same fundamental cruelty. Pike had disabused her of those notions within the first month. Her initial offense had been crying when her brother was sold away to a sugar plantation in Terrebonne Parish, separated from his family to settle gambling debts that Ashford had incurred during a particularly unlucky week in New Orleans. Pike's response had been swift and public. 5 lashes administered in front of the assembled workers to teach everyone that emotional attachment was a luxury that enslaved people couldn't afford. Her mother had died 2 years later, worked to exhaustion in the cotton fields, and denied medical attention for pneumonia that developed during an unusually cold January. Talisa had been moved to the kitchen house after that, promoted to a position that other slaves envied because it meant working indoors and receiving better food rations. But kitchen work brought her into closer contact with Pike, who made his evening inspections of the house servants with particular attention to women who caught his interest. The pattern had been established quickly. Pike would find fault with her work, some minor imperfection in how she'd scrubbed floors or prepared vegetables or maintained the kitchen fire. The criticism would escalate to punishment, and punishment would include touching that went beyond what any legitimate discipline required. She'd learned to endure his hands on her body the same way she'd learned to endure the whip, by separating her mind from her flesh and retreating to some internal space where his actions couldn't reach her essential self. But last Tuesday had been different. Pike had been drinking heavily, celebrating some business success with Ashford that had put both men in expansive moods. He'd come to the kitchen house after midnight, reeking of bourbon and entitlement, expecting the kind of access that he considered his right as overseer. When Talise had tried to refuse, when she'd made the mistake of saying the word no to a man who'd never heard that word from enslaved people he supervised, his response had been volcanic. The beating that followed had been worse than any previous punishment. Pike had used his fists rather than the whip, leaving bruises that wouldn't show under clothing but would throb for weeks afterward. He'd told her that she was getting ideas above her station, that she needed to remember what she was and who owned her body along with her labor. Then he'd done what he'd come to do, taking what he wanted while she stared at the kitchen ceiling and counted the exposed beams until it was over. From a plantation ledger dated August 2, 1852, kitchen servant Talise Corvain disciplined for insubordination and failure to maintain proper respect for supervisory authority. No reduction in work capacity anticipated. Matter considered resolved. What the ledger didn't record was Talise's transformation during the days that followed. The bruises faded, but something else emerged in their place, something harder than the Louisiana soil she'd worked since being assigned to kitchen duties. The part of her that had tried to survive through submission, that had believed endurance was the only available strategy, that part had died on the kitchen floor, while Pike grunted above her, and the fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed similar scenes too many times to count. When the bruises faded to yellow and green, Talise returned to her duties with an efficiency that surprised even the other house servants. She worked with mechanical precision, completing tasks without error or complaint, moving through the kitchen house like a woman who'd found clarity in suffering. The other slaves recognized the change without understanding its source. They gave her space, avoided questions, pretended not to notice when she stood at the kitchen window staring toward the kennels with expressions that suggested she was calculating something complex and terrible. Old Benjamin had seen that look before. He'd watched it develop in the eyes of people pushed beyond the limits of what human beings could endure and remain human. Some broke completely, losing their minds to fever dreams and delusions that offered escape through insanity. Others turned the violence inward, finding release through self-destruction that at least gave them control over their own deaths. But a few, a very few, transformed their suffering into something calculated and cold, becoming predators who understood that survival sometimes required eliminating the threat rather than learning to live with it. He'd tended Talise's injuries with poultices, made from herbs he'd gathered along the bayou channels, his weathered hands gentle despite decades of field work that had left them scarred and calloused. She'd barely spoken during those treatments, just endured the pain of healing with the same stoic silence she'd shown during the original beating. But her eyes had held calculations that made Benjamin quietly terrified of what she might be planning. "Don't do nothing foolish," he'd warned her on the third night after Pike's attack, keeping his voice low enough that no one else in the cabin could hear. "They'll kill you for it. Kill all of us, maybe. Sell the children downriver and burn the quarters. Whatever you thinkin', it ain't worth that price." Talise had looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her 25 years, aged by experiences that compressed lifetimes of suffering into single moments of absolute clarity. Some prices get paid whether we want to pay them or not. Question is whether we choose what we're buying or just let it be chosen for us. The conversation had ended there, but Benjamin's warning had proven insufficient to stop whatever process had already begun in Talise's mind. She'd been studying Pike's routines for 8 years, memorizing his habits with the attention to detail that enslaved people developed as survival mechanism. She knew when he made his rounds which paths he preferred, where he stopped to check on property or count inventory. She knew his weaknesses, his patterns, the predictable rhythms of a man who'd never imagined his victims might be documenting his vulnerabilities with the same systematic attention he applied to maximizing their productivity. The knowledge had been gathering all those years, waiting for the moment when it would transform from passive observation into active planning. Pike's attack had provided that moment, crossing some internal threshold that turned Talise from victim into strategist, from prey into something considerably more dangerous. She'd learned to butcher animals in the kitchen house, developing skills with knives and cleavers that had impressed even the plantation's regular butcher. She could break down a deer carcass in under an hour, separating meat from bone with efficient cuts that wasted nothing. She understood anatomy from necessity, knew which joints separated easily and which required patient sawing, had memorized the relationship between size and portion control through years of preparing meals for people who took her skills for granted. Those same skills could be applied to different subjects if circumstances demanded adaptation. A man was just another animal when reduced to component parts, just meat and bone and organs that performed the same basic functions regardless of skin color or legal status. The tools hanging in the kitchen house could serve multiple purposes when necessity required innovation, and courage replaced the fear that had kept her compliant for 8 terrible years. The fever came on the 3rd night after Pike's attack, burning through Talisa's body like fire consuming dry timber. Her skin turned hot to the touch while chills racked her frame, making her teeth chatter despite the August heat that turned the slave quarters into an airless oven. Old Benjamin sat beside her pallet, changing the damp cloths on her forehead and whispering prayers that mixed Christian terminology with older traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and generations of forced conversion. But this wasn't ordinary illness. The fever carried away something essential, burning through the last remnants of the person who'd believed that survival required submission and endurance. What remained when the temperature finally broke near midnight was someone different, someone harder and colder than the bayou water that flowed past Blackwater Estate on its way to the Gulf of Mexico. Talisa's eyes opened with clarity that seemed unnatural after 3 days of delirium. She sat up on her pallet, movements deliberate and controlled, as if her body had been reorganized according to new principles during the fever's transformation. The other women in the cabin watched her with mixture of concern and recognition, understanding that something fundamental had shifted even if they couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. "I'm going to kill him," Talisa said, her voice steady and emotionless as stating simple fact about weather or crop conditions. "Going to take him apart piece by piece and feed every bit to those dogs he loves more than people. Going to make sure there's nothing left that anyone can find or bury or mourn." The words fell into silence so complete that the usual nighttime sounds of the quarters seemed amplified by contrast. Crickets chirped outside, frogs called from the bayou channels, somewhere a baby cried itself back to sleep. The woman stared at Talise with expressions ranging from horror to something that might have been hope, though hope mixed with fear created combinations too complex for simple classification. Old Ruth, who'd survived 60 years of plantation life through careful navigation of power dynamics she couldn't control, finally spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen dozens of rebellions fail and their participants sold or killed. "Child, that kind of talk gets people killed, gets whole quarters burned, gets babies sold away from mothers and husbands whipped to death in front of their wives. Whatever he done to you, it ain't worth that price." But Talisa's expression didn't change, didn't soften with the appeal to collective consequences or threats of retaliation. "He's going to keep doing it. To me, to others, to whoever catches his attention next. Men like Pike don't stop because we ask nicely or submit better or work harder. They stop when something makes them stop. And the only thing that's going to stop Edmund Pike is dying." The logic was unassailable, even if the conclusion remained terrifying. Everyone in that cabin knew Talise was right about Pike's nature, about the inevitability of continued abuse, about the impossibility of reform or redemption for men who viewed enslaved people as property, to be used and discarded according to whim and convenience. But knowing something was true didn't make acting on that knowledge less dangerous, or its consequences less catastrophic for everyone involved. "How you planning to do this thing?" The question came from Miriam, a field hand whose husband had been sold 2 years earlier after Pike accused him of looking at a white woman with insufficient deference. Her voice carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment, as if she was asking about cooking techniques rather than murder methodology. Talise sat up straighter, and in the dim light filtering through cabin cracks, the other women could see that she'd been thinking about this question for considerably longer than the 3 days of fever. "Pike makes his rounds same time every night. 9 o'clock, walks the same path, checks the same buildings in the same order. Predictable as sunrise. Man's got routines he follows like scripture. Never varies unless something forces him off schedule." She paused, letting the implications settle. Every woman in that cabin knew Pike's patterns, had learned them through necessity and survival instinct. They understood that predictability created vulnerability, that routines became weapons when turned against those who depended on them for false sense of security and control. Tuesday nights he inspects the gin house last, spends about 30 minutes checking machinery and tallying cotton production. Goes there alone, because he don't trust nobody else with his numbers. That's when I'll take him, when he's focused on his ledgers and not expecting anything but moths and moonlight. The plan unfolded in whispered detail that revealed months of observation and strategic thinking. Talise had been studying Pike the way a hunter studies dangerous prey, noting patterns and weaknesses, identifying moments of vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with sufficient motivation and courage. The fever hadn't created this plan. It had simply burned away the last internal barriers that had prevented her from acknowledging what she'd already been preparing to do. "The dogs," old Ruth interjected, her practical mind identifying the obvious flaw in any plan to eliminate an overseer. "Pike's dogs know everyone on this plantation. They bark when strangers come around, when anything changes from normal routine. How you planning to get past them without raising alarm that brings everyone running?" Talisa's smile contained no humor, just cold calculation that made her look decades older than her 25 years. "Those dogs know me. I feed them scraps from the kitchen house, been doing it for years. They come to the fence wagging their tails when they smell me coming, because they associate me with food and kindness." Pike trained them to hunt runaways, but he never trained them to suspect the person who brings their meals. The reversal was elegant in its simplicity. Pike's own dogs would become instruments of his disposal, consuming their master because someone had spent years building trust and association that overcame their training. The animals wouldn't distinguish between usual scraps and unusual meat, because Talise had conditioned them to accept whatever she brought as safe and desirable. "What about after?" Miriam asked quietly. "What happens when Pike disappears and they start asking questions and looking for someone to blame? You think Master Ashford just gonna accept his overseer vanishing without investigating every soul on this plantation?" The question hung in the humid air while Talise considered responses that would satisfy both practical concerns and the deeper fear that revenge might cost more than it gained. "They'll investigate, sure. But what they going to find? Pike will be gone completely, nothing left but maybe some scraps too small to identify. The dogs will have full bellies, but they always have full bellies. And I'll be right here, sick in my cabin like old Benjamin been telling everyone, too weak to do anything but lie on my pallet and pray for healing." She gestured to the other women with expression that mixed appeal and command. "You all seen me burning with fever these past 3 days. You all know I've been too sick to leave this cabin, too weak to walk more than a few steps without help." That's what you'll tell them when they ask. Because it's truth mixed with just enough lie to protect everyone. I've been sick, that's documented fact. What I do between fever spells, that's my business, and mine alone. The transformation was complete. The woman who'd endured 8 years of systematic abuse had evolved into someone capable of planning and executing calculated revenge with strategic precision that would have impressed military commanders. The fever had been catalyst rather than cause, burning away restraints that had kept her compliant, while revealing the core of determination and intelligence that had survived, despite Pike's best efforts to break her spirit along with her body. From the secret journal of Talise Corvain, discovered hidden beneath floorboards in 1891, August 5, 1852. "The fever showed me truth I've been avoiding. Survival ain't enough when survival means dying piece by piece every day. Better to risk everything for one chance at justice than live another year under Pike's hands. The dogs will eat well Tuesday night, and I'll sleep better than I have in 8 years knowing he can't hurt nobody else ever again." The other women in the cabin understood they'd become accessories to conspiracy whether they wanted that burden or not. Knowledge created complicity, and complicity created shared risk that could destroy their community if the plan failed, or if anyone broke under interrogation that would inevitably follow Pike's disappearance. But they also understood that Talisa was right about the fundamental problem. Pike wouldn't stop, wouldn't reform, wouldn't suddenly develop conscience or compassion that might make continued submission bearable. Old Ruth reached out and placed her weathered hand on Talisa's shoulder, the gesture carrying weight of decision made despite better judgment and survival instinct. "You do this thing, you do it clean. No evidence, no witnesses, nothing that leads back here or puts these other women at risk. And when they come asking questions, we all been sleeping peaceful, ain't heard nothing unusual, don't know nothing about where Pike might have gone." The pact was sealed without formal agreement, bound by shared understanding of stakes involved and consequences that would follow either action or inaction. The women in that cabin became co-conspirators through silence, agreeing to protect Talisa's secret because the alternative meant accepting Pike's continued presence and everything that implied for their own safety and the safety of daughters who would eventually grow old enough to catch his attention. Talise spent the next 3 days preparing with methodical attention to detail that revealed how long she'd been thinking about this possibility. She tested the kitchen knives, determining which held their edge best and which handles provided most secure grip. She studied the dog's feeding schedule, learning when they were most hungry and most receptive to unexpected meals. She mapped Pike's Tuesday night routine down to the minute, identifying the precise moment when he would be most vulnerable and least likely to expect attack. The transformation from victim to predator required crossing psychological thresholds that most people never approached. Talise had to imagine herself committing violence, had to visualize the act of killing in sufficient detail that she wouldn't freeze when the moment arrived. She had to overcome instincts toward mercy and hesitation, replacing them with cold determination that would allow her to follow through, regardless of Pike's pleas or her own revulsion at what she was becoming. But the alternative was returning to submission, accepting that Pike owned not just her labor but her body and her future. That alternative had become impossible during the fever that burned away her capacity for continued endurance. She'd crossed some internal Rubicon where death seemed preferable to another day of Pike's hands on her skin, another night of staring at kitchen ceiling while he took what he wanted and she pretended to be somewhere else. Tuesday was coming, arriving with the inevitability of tides and seasons. When it came, Talise would be ready with sharp blades and sharper purpose, prepared to reduce Edmund Pike to portions small enough for hunting dogs to consume over the course of a week. The breaking point had passed. What remained was execution, in both senses of that word. The kitchen house became Talise's laboratory during the 4 days between her fever breaking and Tuesday's arrival. She moved through her duties with mechanical efficiency, while her mind calculated angles and logistics, timing and disposal methods, every detail that could mean the difference between successful execution and catastrophic failure that would end with her death, and likely the deaths of everyone who'd shared her cabin. The cleaver hung from its usual hook beside the fireplace, its edge honed to razor sharpness through years of breaking down deer carcasses and hog quarters. Talise had maintained that blade personally, understanding that dull tools meant harder work and longer exposure to tasks she preferred to complete quickly. Now she tested the edge against her thumb with delicate pressure, feeling how easily it would part flesh from bone when applied with sufficient force and proper technique. But one blade wouldn't be sufficient for the work ahead. Pike was a large man, heavily muscled from years of physical labor and violence. Reducing him to portions manageable for dog consumption would require multiple tools employed in strategic sequence. The boning knife would separate joints where cleaver work might shatter bone and create fragments too large for dogs to consume safely. The skinning blade would remove clothing efficiently. The meat saw would handle sections where neither knife nor cleaver could achieve clean separation. She'd learned these techniques through necessity, not choice. Kitchen servants at Blackwater were expected to process whatever game the hunting parties brought back from expeditions into the bayou swamps. Deer, wild hog, the occasional alligator that had wandered too close to plantation boundaries. Talise had developed expertise that impressed even the plantation's contracted butcher, a free man of color who visited monthly to slaughter livestock and prepare meat for smoking and preservation. From that butcher she'd learned anatomy lessons never intended for the purposes she now contemplated, where major blood vessels ran close to the surface, which cuts would incapacitate quickly versus slowly, how to drain a carcass efficiently to prevent meat spoilage. The knowledge had seemed academic when applied to animals, but bodies were bodies regardless of species, and the principles transferred with disturbing ease once you accepted that men were just another form of meat when reduced to component parts. The gin house provided the perfect location for initial work. The building sat isolated from both the slave quarters and the main house, positioned at the edge of the cotton fields, where the noise of machinery during processing season masked other sounds that might otherwise attract unwanted attention. The wooden structure contained equipment that could serve multiple purposes when imagination met necessity. Talise had cleaned that gin house dozens of times, scrubbing cotton dust from every surface and maintaining machinery that processed the plantation's primary product. She knew which floorboards were loose, where blood could drain without leaving permanent stains, which tools hung on which walls. The space had been mapped in her memory through years of forced familiarity, and now that mental map became blueprint for murder. Pike's routine never varied on Tuesday evenings. He would enter the gin house at exactly 9:15 carrying his lantern and ledger book. He would spend 5 minutes inspecting the cotton press, checking for wear or damage that might reduce efficiency. Then 10 minutes examining the gin mechanism itself, ensuring that teeth and rollers maintained proper alignment. Finally, 15 minutes reviewing production numbers, comparing current output against previous weeks to identify trends that might indicate problems requiring his attention. That final 15 minutes when Pike would be bent over his ledger book with lantern positioned to illuminate the pages, that was when Talise would strike. His concentration would be absolute, focused on numbers that represented human suffering converted into profit margins. His back would be turned to the door. His hands would be occupied with papers and pencil. The gin house machinery would muffle any sounds of approach, the creaking of wood and whisper of air through gaps in the walls creating acoustic cover for footsteps on sawdust-covered floors. But killing Pike was only the first step in a plan that required much more complex execution than simple murder. The body had to disappear completely, leaving no evidence that could be connected to any specific individual. That meant systematic dismemberment, followed by disposal that wouldn't attract attention, or create physical evidence that could survive even cursory investigation. The hunting dogs provided the solution with elegant simplicity. Pike had trained them to consume meat scraps, table waste, and portions of game animals too damaged or spoiled for human consumption. They were accustomed to being fed after dark, receiving their evening meal around 10 o'clock when kitchen work was completed. Their kennel sat 50 yards from the gin house, close enough for efficient transport but far enough that their noise wouldn't immediately alert anyone to unusual activity. Talise had been cultivating relationships with those dogs for years, bringing them choice scraps and learning their individual temperaments. Rex, the pack leader, would eat almost anything and intimidate the others into accepting his choices. Brutus preferred meat with fat still attached, bones he could gnaw for hours. Belle, the only female in the pack, was pickiest about freshness, but also most food-motivated when offered something that met her standards. She knew their feeding hierarchy, which dogs ate first, and which waited for permission. She understood their body language, could read the difference between aggressive posturing and genuine threat. Most importantly, she'd established herself as source of positive association, someone whose scent meant food and kindness rather than commands and punishment. The plan required precise timing, coordinated across multiple locations. Pike would die in the gin house between 9:30 and 9:35, during the window when his attention was most focused on ledger work. Immediate drainage would prevent blood pooling that might seep through floorboards and create stains visible during daylight inspection. Initial dismemberment would reduce the body to portions that could be transported in the wheelbarrow, used for moving cotton bales, covered with burlap that would attract no attention if anyone happened to glimpse it being moved after dark. Transportation to the kennels would occur between 10 o'clock and 10:15, during the period when other slaves had retired to their quarters and before Ashford typically made his own evening inspection of the property. The dogs would receive their first feeding immediately, consuming portions small enough to prevent digestive problems, but substantial enough to satisfy their appetites and establish the pattern that would continue over subsequent nights. Talise had calculated that Pike's body, properly sectioned, would provide approximately 7 days of supplemental feeding for 12 hunting dogs. Small portions distributed across the week would attract less attention than a single massive feast that might make the animals sick or overly aggressive. Gradual consumption would also allow time for evidence to be thoroughly processed through digestive systems that reduced everything to waste that could be buried or scattered without raising suspicion. The tools had been assembled piece by piece, moved from kitchen house to gin house during legitimate cleaning duties that gave her access without requiring explanation. She'd hidden them beneath loose floorboards in the northeast corner, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust and discovery. 3 knives of varying sizes, 1 cleaver, 1 meat saw, 2 buckets for containing fluids, burlap sacks for wrapping portions, lye soap for cleaning surfaces, and removing biological traces that might betray what had occurred in that space. Old Benjamin had watched these preparations with growing concern, understanding enough about Talise's intentions to fear the consequences but unwilling to directly interfere with her choices. He'd approached her on Monday evening while she sat outside the quarters, staring toward the gin house with expression that mixed determination and something that might have been fear if she'd allowed herself to acknowledge that emotion. "You sure about this path you walk in?" he asked, settling beside her with the careful movements of someone whose body remembered every beating and injury accumulated over 5 decades of plantation life. Once you start down this road, ain't no turning back. Can't undo what's done, or take back what's taken. Talise didn't look at him, just continued staring at the gin house, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Been sure since the fever broke. Maybe been sure longer than that, just didn't want to admit it to myself. Pike ain't gonna stop, Benjamin. He's going to keep taking and hurting until something makes him stop, and the only thing that stops men like him is dying. The old man nodded slowly, acknowledging truth he'd learned through brutal experience. What about after? What about when they come looking for answers and start questioning everyone who might know something? You think Master Ashford just gonna accept his overseer disappearing without investigation and punishment? They can investigate all they want, Talise replied, with confidence born from careful planning rather than reckless optimism. What they gonna find? I've been sick in my cabin, got witnesses to that fact. Pike's gonna be gone completely, nothing left but maybe some bone fragments, too small to identify. The dogs will have eaten well, but dogs always eat when given food. Ain't nothing suspicious about animals consuming what they're fed. She turned to look at Benjamin directly, her eyes reflecting starlight with unusual intensity. I need you to do something for me. Need you to make sure I got alibi that holds up under questioning. Tell anyone who asks that I've been too sick to leave my pallet these past few days, that you've been tending my fever personally, and know for certain I ain't been nowhere near the gin house or kennels. The request made Benjamin complicit in ways that went beyond passive knowledge of conspiracy. But he'd already crossed that threshold by not reporting what he suspected to authorities who might have prevented Pike's murder. Silence created responsibility, and responsibility created shared fate, with the woman sitting beside him planning calculated revenge against an overseer who'd brutalized too many people for too many years. I'll tell them what needs telling. Benjamin finally agreed, his voice carrying resignation mixed with something that might have been approval. But you be careful, girl. You be smart about this thing, and don't let anger make you sloppy. Pike deserves what's coming to him, but you deserve to survive what comes after. Tuesday arrived with the inevitability of judgment, the sun rising over Blackwater Estate, like an indifferent witness to events that would unfold after darkness returned. Talise moved through her kitchen duties with focused calm, preparing meals and cleaning surfaces while her mind rehearsed every step of the plan that would transform her from victim into executioner before midnight arrived. The cleaver had been sharpened one final time. The dogs had been fed lighter portions than usual to ensure their appetite remained sharp. The gin house waited in deliberate silence, its machinery idle, and its shadows ready to conceal work that would reduce Edmund Pike to nothing more than scattered bones and satisfied animals. The gin house stood silent as a tomb when Edmund Pike pushed open its wooden door at exactly 9:14 p.m., 1 minute ahead of his usual schedule. The early arrival sent a jolt of adrenaline through Talisa's system as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind stacked cotton bales, her right hand gripping the cleaver with white-knuckled intensity, while her left held the boning knife against her thigh. Every muscle in her body had tensed with predatory stillness, the kind of frozen alertness that separated successful hunters from those who telegraphed their presence through involuntary movement. Pike's lantern cast dancing shadows across the machinery, illuminating iron gears and wooden rollers with flickering light that transformed familiar equipment into something abstract and almost beautiful. The overseer moved with his characteristic confidence, boots heavy on the sawdust-covered floor, creating rhythmic thuds that marked his progress toward the cotton press at the building's far end. He showed no awareness that anything had changed, no instinct warning him that the gin house contained more than machinery and moonlight filtering through wall cracks. Talise controlled her breathing with conscious effort, drawing air slowly through her nose and releasing it silently through parted lips. The technique was one she'd learned during childhood, back when hiding from overseers during moments of unauthorized rest required absolute stillness. Now she applied those lessons to different purpose, remaining motionless, while Pike completed his inspection of the press mechanism, his attention focused on checking bolts and examining the wooden frame for signs of stress or damage. The minutes stretched like hours while Pike moved through his routine with methodical precision, 5 minutes at the press, exactly as predicted. Then his migration toward the gin mechanism itself, where he spent another 10 minutes examining the saw teeth that separated cotton fibers from their seeds. Talise tracked his movements through gaps in the cotton bales, watching his profile as he bent close to inspect machinery with the care of someone whose livelihood depended on maintaining equipment efficiency. Finally, at 9:29, Pike settled at the small desk positioned near the eastern wall. He placed his lantern on the scarred wooden surface, opened his ledger book, and began reviewing production numbers with concentration that blocked out everything beyond the columns of figures representing cotton pounds processed and remaining inventory. His back was turned to the door, to the shadows, to the woman who'd spent 4 days preparing for this exact moment. Talise emerged from concealment with movements so smooth they seemed almost dreamlike, floating across sawdust that muffled her footsteps into whispers, softer than the building's natural creaks and groans. The cleaver felt weightless in her hand despite its substantial heft, transformed by adrenaline and purpose into an extension of her arm rather than a separate tool requiring conscious manipulation. Pike must have sensed something, some shift in air pressure or primitive warning system that evolution had embedded in human nervous systems for exactly these circumstances. He started to turn, his hand moving toward the pistol he kept on his belt for dealing with uncooperative slaves or aggressive wildlife. But the movement came too late, hindered by reflexes slowed by whiskey consumption, and the comfortable assumption that gin houses contained no threats requiring his defensive attention. The cleaver's edge caught him between the shoulder blades with force that drove the blade deep into tissue and bone, the impact producing a sound like an axe biting into hardwood. Pike's scream died in his throat as the boning knife found the space beneath his ribs, angled upward toward his heart with precision learned from years of field-dressing deer carcasses. The techniques transferred seamlessly from animal to human anatomy, the blades sliding between bone structures with practiced ease. Pike collapsed forward across his ledger book, his blood spraying across neat columns of numbers and transforming profit calculations into abstract art painted in arterial red. His body convulsed with diminishing strength, limbs thrashing in the uncoordinated movements of a nervous system, receiving contradictory signals from damaged organs. The sounds he made were wet and terrible, gurgling attempts at screams that couldn't force their way past a windpipe filling with blood from internal injuries. Talisa stood over him, watching his death with expression that mixed satisfaction and something darker, something that emerged when years of brutalization finally found outlet through calculated violence. This was the man who'd beaten her, violated her, treated her body as property to be used according to his convenience and desire. Now he was dying on a gin house floor, drowning in his own blood, while the woman he'd victimized watched with eyes that held no pity or mercy. The dying took longer than she'd anticipated. Pike's body refused to surrender, despite wounds that would have dropped a younger man instantly, clinging to life with the stubborn determination of someone who'd never accepted that death was inevitable. 8 minutes passed while his movements gradually weakened, his breathing transformed from ragged gasps to shallow whispers, his eyes fading from terror to confusion, to the empty stare of someone who'd finally crossed the boundary between living and dead. When his chest stopped moving, when the last breath rattled out of lungs that would never draw air again, Talise allowed herself a moment of stillness. The reality of what she'd done settled over her like physical weight, pressing down with the understanding that she'd crossed a threshold that could never be recrossed. She'd taken a human life, reduced a man to meat and memory through calculated violence that made her both executioner and liberator. But reflection was luxury she couldn't afford, the hard work was just beginning, and dawn would arrive in less than 9 hours. She needed to transform Pike's corpse into portions manageable for dog consumption, clean every surface that might retain biological evidence, and transport the results to the kennels before anyone noticed his absence or began asking questions about unusual activity near the gin house. The blood had to be addressed first. It pooled beneath Pike's body, seeping into sawdust that absorbed the fluid with disturbing efficiency. Talise had anticipated this problem, positioning the kill near the building's northeastern corner, where loose floorboards could be removed to allow drainage into the soil beneath the structure. She worked quickly, pulling boards and watching blood flow into earth that had absorbed generations of suffering and would hold this secret as thoroughly as it held moisture from yesterday's rain. Dismemberment required systematic approach that separated emotional response from mechanical necessity. Talise had to view Pike's body the way she'd view a deer carcass, as raw material requiring processing rather than person who'd once possessed consciousness and agency. The mental shift proved easier than expected, facilitated by years of practice and the understanding that squeamishness would slow work that needed completion before midnight. She started with the major sections, using the cleaver to separate limbs at shoulder and hip joints, where cartilage provided natural division points. The boning knife completed work that the cleaver initiated, sliding between bone structures and severing tendons with cuts informed by anatomical knowledge accumulated through necessity. Each section was wrapped in burlap and loaded into the wheelbarrow that waited outside the gin house's rear entrance. The torso required more complex approach, ribs protecting internal organs that needed removal before the chest cavity could be reduced to manageable portions. Talise worked with focused concentration, her hands steady despite the horror of what they accomplished. The meat saw handled sections where neither knife nor cleaver could achieve clean separation, its teeth designed for bone cutting through human skeleton, with the same efficiency it showed on deer or hog carcasses. Pike's head presented psychological challenge that exceeded the technical difficulty. Looking into the face of someone she'd killed, even someone who'd caused her immense suffering, created moment of hesitation that threatened to derail the entire operation. But she pushed through the reluctance, wrapping the head in multiple layers of burlap before adding it to the wheelbarrow's growing load. 3 hours after Pike's death, the gin house showed no obvious evidence of what had occurred within its walls. The floorboards had been replaced, sawdust that had absorbed blood had been gathered and buried beneath the building's foundation. Every surface had been scrubbed with lye soap and water drawn from the nearby well. The tools had been cleaned and returned to their hiding place, ready for disposal at a later date when throwing them into the bayou wouldn't attract attention. The wheelbarrow was loaded with approximately 170 pounds of remains, divided into portions that would feed 12 dogs over the course of a week, without overwhelming their digestive systems or creating behavioral changes that might alert kennel staff to unusual circumstances. Talise covered the load with additional burlap and a layer of cotton scraps, creating the appearance of routine materials transport that wouldn't warrant second glance if anyone happened to observe her movement across the property. The journey from gin house to kennels covered 50 yards of open ground, exposed to moonlight and potential observation from multiple vantage points. Talise moved with deliberate casualness, pushing the wheelbarrow at pace that suggested routine work rather than furtive activity. Her heart hammered against her ribs with intensity that made breathing difficult, but her external appearance remained calm and purposeful. The dogs recognized her scent before she reached the kennel fence, their tails beginning to wag with anticipation of the feeding that her presence typically announced. Rex approached the gate first, his massive head pushing against the wooden slats with friendly aggression that had been conditioned through years of positive reinforcement. The other dogs followed his lead, gathering at the fence line with expressions of canine enthusiasm that made no distinction between their usual evening meal and the unusual feast that Talise was about to provide. She opened the gate with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts at control, entering the kennel area with wheelbarrow and its terrible cargo. The dogs surrounded her immediately, their noses working overtime to identify the source of the blood smell that permeated the burlap wrapping. Their excitement escalated as she began unwrapping portions, revealing meat that their training hadn't prepared them to recognize as anything other than food suitable for consumption. What followed tested the limits of what Talise could witness without breaking. The dogs fell on Pike's remains with savage enthusiasm, their teeth tearing through tissue with efficiency that evolution had perfected over thousands of years. They showed no hesitation, no reluctance to consume flesh that had recently housed consciousness and cruelty in equal measure. To them, this was simply food, nourishment provided by someone they trusted and associated with positive outcomes. Talise distributed the portions according to her carefully developed plan, giving each dog enough to satisfy immediate hunger without creating digestive problems that might attract unwanted attention. The remainder was hidden in the kennel's storage shed, wrapped and positioned to appear like routine supplies rather than evidence of systematic murder. Over the next 6 nights, she would return to provide additional feedings, gradually reducing Pike to nothing more than scattered bones and satisfied animals. The dogs cleaned their bowls with thorough efficiency, their tongues working to capture every trace of the meal that Talise had provided. When they'd finished, they settled into their usual sleeping positions, exhibiting no behavioral changes that might suggest they'd consumed anything other than their standard evening rations. The transformation from man to dog food was complete, accomplished with methodical precision that left no obvious evidence of what had occurred. Talise returned the wheelbarrow to its storage location, her movements automatic as exhaustion began replacing the adrenaline that had sustained her through 3 hours of butchery and disposal. Her hands ached from gripping tools, her back protested the physical labor of dismemberment and transport. But beneath the fatigue lived satisfaction that ran deeper than physical sensation, the knowledge that Edmund Pike would never hurt her or anyone else again. The slave quarters were dark and silent when she finally returned, slipping into the cabin where other women pretended sleep while tracking her movements through barely opened eyes. She collapsed onto her pallet without undressing, too exhausted for the normal rituals of preparing for rest. Within minutes, genuine sleep claimed her, providing the first peaceful rest she'd experienced in 8 years of living under Pike's supervision and cruelty. Tomorrow would bring investigation and questions, suspicion and fear. But tonight, Talisa slept like the dead, having fed an overseer to his own dogs and transformed herself from victim into something considerably more dangerous than anyone at Blackwater Estate could imagine or prepare to confront. The discovery came at dawn, announced by James Corbett's panicked shouting that echoed across Blackwater Estate like the cries of a man who'd stumbled into his own nightmare. The kennel master had arrived for his usual morning duties to find the dogs in an unusual state, their muzzles stained darker than normal and their behavior suggesting they'd consumed something that exceeded their typical evening rations. The brass button he found wedged between fin slats was just the beginning of evidence that would transform routine mourning into full-scale crisis. Master Nathaniel Ashford emerged from the big house still fastening his shirt, his face flushed with a combination of interrupted sleep and growing alarm as Corbett's incoherent reports filtered through the household. The overseer was missing, the dogs had eaten something unusual, there were fragments scattered in the kennel that shouldn't be there. The pieces didn't connect into coherent narrative yet, but the implications created dread that settled in Ashford's stomach like a stone. By 7 o'clock, the entire plantation had been roused for emergency roll call. The field hands assembled in their usual formations, faces carefully arranged into expressions of confusion and concern that revealed nothing about their actual knowledge or suspicions. They stood silent as statues while Ashford and Corbett moved through the rows, counting heads and searching for any sign of guilt or nervousness that might indicate involvement in Pike's disappearance. Talise stood among the house servants, her posture slightly hunched, as if still recovering from the stomach ailment that old Benjamin had documented over the past week. She kept her eyes downcast in the manner expected of enslaved women, avoiding direct eye contact that might be interpreted as insolence or challenge. Her breathing remained steady despite the fear that coiled in her chest like a living thing, the knowledge that discovery would mean death by torture, followed by public execution designed to terrorize anyone who might consider following her example. "Where's Pike?" Ashford's voice cut through the morning air with authority undermined by obvious anxiety. "Anyone seen the overseer since last night? Anyone hear anything unusual after dark?" The silence stretched like rope under tension, 40 souls maintaining collective ignorance with the discipline of people who'd learned that survival required strategic amnesia. They'd heard nothing, seen nothing, knew nothing about Edmund Pike's whereabouts or the circumstances that had led to his disappearance. The wall of silence was impenetrable, reinforced by generations of practice at protecting dangerous knowledge from those who possessed the power to punish revelation. Old Benjamin stepped forward with the careful deference of someone addressing a master whose mood could shift from curiosity to violence without warning. "Begging your pardon, sir, but last I seen Mr. Pike was yesterday evening when he made his usual rounds. Came through the quarters around 8 o'clock, counted heads, didn't say nothing unusual, figured he was heading to check the gin house like he always does on Tuesday nights." The statement contained just enough truth to be believable while omitting everything that mattered. Pike had indeed made his rounds, had indeed headed toward the gin house. What happened after that remained unspoken, protected by silence that Benjamin and 40 others had agreed to maintain regardless of consequences or intimidation that Ashford might employ to extract confession. Ashford's jaw tightened with frustration as he processed the lack of useful information. Someone searched the gin house, check every building on this property. Pike didn't just vanish into the swamp like morning mist. A man that size leaves traces, and I want those traces found before the day's out. The search parties deployed across Blackwater Estate with systematic thoroughness, examining every structure and questioning every worker with increasing aggression as hours passed without producing results. They found Pike's lantern near the gin house, its oil reservoir empty now after burning through the night. They discovered his ledger book on the desk inside, open to pages documenting Tuesday's cotton production with no indication of interruption or struggle. But they found no blood, no signs of violence, no evidence suggesting that anything unusual had occurred in the gin house beyond routine inspection and record-keeping. Talisa's cleaning had been thorough, eliminating every trace that might connect Pike's death to the location where he'd died. The floorboards showed no stains, the sawdust revealed no unusual discoloration, even the tools hanging on the walls appeared undisturbed and properly maintained. The kennels received particular scrutiny after Corbett's initial discovery, but the evidence there proved ambiguous at best. Yes, the dogs had eaten something that left their muzzles stained darker than usual. Yes, there were fragments of cloth and the brass button that seemed to match Pike's personal effects. But dogs scavenged all sorts of things, consumed whatever they could find when given opportunity. The fragments might have come from Pike, or they might represent coincidental discoveries that the animals had picked up during their daily routines. From the private journal of Nathaniel Ashford, August 11, 1852, Pike's disappearance defies rational explanation. No body, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play beyond suspicious fragments that prove nothing definitive. The slaves maintain their infuriating silence, protecting knowledge that could resolve this mystery if they possessed courage to speak truth. But they fear each other more than they fear me. Bound by codes I cannot break through conventional interrogation. The investigation intensified as word spread beyond Blackwater's boundaries. Neighboring plantation owners arrived to offer assistance and express concern that Pike's disappearance might represent broader threat to overseer safety throughout St. Mary Parish. If one supervisor could vanish without trace, what prevented similar fates from befalling others who maintained discipline through methods that created enemies among the people they controlled? Sheriff William Morrison arrived on the third day, bringing deputies and dogs trained to track human scent across difficult terrain. They searched the bayou channels, dragged sections of standing water, examined every path and hiding place within 5 miles of the plantation. The investigation consumed resources and attention that normally went toward cotton production, disrupting routines and creating an atmosphere of suspicion that made normal plantation operations nearly impossible. But Talise had anticipated this response, had planned for exactly this level of scrutiny and investigation. The dogs that Morrison brought found nothing because there was nothing to find beyond the kennels where Pike's remains had already been consumed and processed into waste that held no identifiable characteristics. The bayou searches proved fruitless because Pike's body had never entered the water. The interrogations produced no confessions because the only person who knew the complete truth maintained her carefully constructed alibi of illness and weakness. The other house servants supported Talisa's story with consistent testimony that she'd been too sick to leave her pallet during the critical period when Pike disappeared. Old Benjamin provided detailed accounts of her fever, describing symptoms with medical precision that suggested genuine illness rather than manufactured excuse. The women from her cabin corroborated the timeline, confirming that Talise had been present throughout the night, delirious with fever, and incapable of the physical exertion that would have been required to kill and dispose of a man Pike's size. The alibi held under pressure that would have broken weaker constructions. Morrison questioned Talise directly, his eyes searching her face for signs of deception or guilt that might betray knowledge she shouldn't possess. But she met his gaze with the blank submission of someone who'd spent 8 years perfecting the art of revealing nothing through expression or body language. "You hear anything unusual Tuesday night?" Morrison demanded, his voice sharp with frustration at the lack of progress his investigation had achieved. "See anyone moving around after dark? Notice anything different about the overseer's routine?" Talise shook her head with apparent confusion, her voice weak as if speaking required effort that exceeded her limited reserves. "No, sir. I've been sick since last week, burning with fever that made everything seem like bad dreams. Don't remember much beyond old Benjamin bringing water and the other women taking turns sitting with me, so I wouldn't be alone if the fever got worse." The performance was flawless, supported by physical evidence of recent illness, and corroborated by multiple witnesses whose stories aligned without seeming rehearsed or coordinated. Morrison had no grounds to suspect her beyond the general suspicion he directed toward all enslaved people on the property. and suspicion without evidence was insufficient to justify the kind of harsh interrogation that might have broken someone less prepared or less committed to maintaining their constructed narrative. By the end of the first week, the investigation had stalled completely. Pike remained missing, presumed dead, but with no body to confirm that assumption or provide clues about who might have been responsible for his demise. The brass button and cloth fragments had been examined by every available expert, but no one could definitively prove they'd come from Pike rather than some other source that the dogs had scavenged during their daily activities. Ashford faced impossible choice between acknowledging that his overseer had been murdered by slaves who'd successfully concealed all evidence, or accepting that Pike had somehow vanished through circumstances that defied explanation but didn't directly implicate his workforce. The first option would require admitting that enslaved people possessed intelligence and organizational capacity that undermined every justification for the system itself. The second option allowed operations to continue without confronting uncomfortable truths about the nature of resistance and the limits of control. He chose the comfortable lie, declaring that Pike had likely absconded with plantation funds and fled to avoid debts that investigation had discovered. The explanation satisfied no one who knew Pike's character, but it provided official narrative that allowed Blackwater Estate to move forward without the paralyzing uncertainty that genuine mystery would have created. The field hands returned to their cotton rows, the house servants resumed their duties, and life at Blackwater continued as if Edmund Pike had never existed. Only the dogs seemed different, more restless and aggressive than before, as if they'd tasted something that had changed them in ways that couldn't be reversed through training or discipline. The story of Edmund Pike's disappearance spread through slave networks with the speed of fire through dry grass, carried by field hands who visited neighboring plantations on authorized errands and house servants who overheard conversations between masters who discussed the mystery with mixture of concern and fascination. By September, enslaved people across 3 parishes knew that an overseer had vanished at Blackwater Estate, consumed by his own dogs after someone had reduced him to portions small enough for animal consumption. The details grew more elaborate with each retelling, embellished by people who understood that stories possessed power beyond their literal truth. Some versions claimed that Talise had used conjure magic learned from her grandmother, calling on spirits to aid her revenge and protect her from discovery. Others suggested she'd received help from a network of resistors who specialized in eliminating particularly brutal overseers through methods that left no evidence connecting deaths to specific individuals. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more terrifying than the legends. One woman, armed with kitchen knives and careful planning, had killed an overseer and disposed of his body so thoroughly that even extensive investigation produced no actionable evidence. The implications rippled through communities that had been taught their entire lives that resistance was futile and submission was the only path to survival. In the quarters at neighboring plantations, enslaved people began viewing their overseers with different eyes. The men who supervised their labor, who wielded whips and pistols and the authority to destroy families on administrative whim, these men suddenly seemed less invincible than they'd appeared just weeks earlier. If Pike could disappear, if Talise could kill and escape punishment, then perhaps the system that seemed eternal and unchangeable actually contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with sufficient courage and strategic thinking. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. Field hands, who'd previously accepted beatings without resistance, began finding small ways to push back against excessive cruelty. House servants who'd endured sexual exploitation started exploring options for protecting themselves, or eliminating threats through methods that wouldn't obviously connect back to them. The seed that Talise had planted with cleaver and calculation was growing in soil fertilized by generations of suffering, and watered by hope that justice might be possible, even within systems designed to prevent it. From a coded letter intercepted near Baton Rouge, October 1852, the machinery continues to malfunction in unexpected ways. Overseers are modifying their routines, avoiding isolated locations and varying their schedules to prevent prediction. But fear works both ways, and men who must constantly guard against their property are learning that absolute control requires constant vigilance that becomes its own form of imprisonment. The resistance evolved beyond individual acts of revenge into something more organized and systematic. Safe houses along the Underground Railroad began receiving visitors seeking not escape to the north, but training in techniques for eliminating threats while maintaining plausible deniability. The networks that had specialized in helping people flee bondage now developed parallel operations focused on transforming plantation conditions through strategic removal of the most brutal overseers and masters. Talise herself became a symbolic figure in these developing networks, though she remained physically at Blackwater Estate working in the kitchen house as if nothing had changed. Her name circulated through resistance circles as proof that careful planning could overcome superior force, that intelligence and patience could achieve victories that strength and anger could not. She demonstrated that the system's apparent invincibility was partly illusion maintained through psychological intimidation rather than actual impenetrability. But the expansion of resistance created countermeasures that threatened everyone who might be involved in what plantation owners began calling the, quote, overseer crisis. By November, insurance companies were refusing to cover supervisors who worked alone after dark. Planters throughout Louisiana implemented new security protocols requiring overseers to travel in pairs and vary their routines to prevent the kind of prediction that had made Pike vulnerable. Some estates hired additional guards specifically to protect supervisors from the very people they supervised. The economic impact proved substantial. Extra security required additional expenditure that reduced profit margins. The fear of overseer violence made qualified candidates reluctant to accept positions that had previously been considered desirable. Some plantations experienced productivity declines as supervisors focused more on protecting themselves than on maximizing cotton output. The system was adapting to defend itself, but adaptation required acknowledgement that enslaved people posed genuine threats requiring serious countermeasures. Parish authorities responded with increased brutality designed to terrorize anyone considering resistance. Public whippings became more frequent and more severe. Families were separated as punishment for suspected involvement in overseer disappearances that occurred at plantations throughout the region. The crackdown created an atmosphere of fear that matched the hope that Pike's death had generated. Two opposing forces pushing against each other with intensity that made normal plantation operations increasingly difficult. Yet the resistance continued evolving, learning from failures and adapting to new security measures with the same strategic intelligence that had characterized Talise's original plan. When overseers began traveling in pairs, accidents started occurring that claimed both supervisors simultaneously. When plantation owners installed better locks and lighting, fires broke out in isolated buildings that trapped their victims before help could arrive. The methods changed, but the fundamental pattern remained consistent. Brutal overseers were dying in ways that appeared accidental, but shared characteristics suggesting coordination and planning. The slave quarters at Blackwater had transformed in subtle ways that outsiders might not notice, but that the community recognized as fundamental shift in power dynamics. Workers moved with slightly more confidence, spoke with fractionally less deference, maintained boundaries that hadn't existed before Pike's disappearance. They understood that Talise had changed the calculus of resistance, had demonstrated that the most brutal enforcers of the system could be eliminated if someone possessed sufficient determination and strategic intelligence. Master Ashford noticed these changes without fully understanding their source or implications. His workers were less responsive to threats, slower to comply with orders, more willing to risk punishment for minor acts of resistance that would have been unthinkable when Pike had supervised daily operations. The new overseer he'd hired proved less effective than Pike had been, either because he lacked Pike's brutal efficiency or because the workforce had learned they didn't have to submit to treatment they found intolerable. Production at Blackwater declined 15% in the months following Pike's disappearance, representing substantial financial loss that Ashford couldn't fully explain through conventional analysis. The cotton still grew in the fields, the gin still processed fibers into marketable products, but something essential had changed in the relationship between labor and management. The workers had discovered agency, and that discovery couldn't be undone through whipping or threats, or any of the traditional mechanisms that had maintained control for generations. From the Secret Journal of Talise Corvain, November 1852, they still don't understand what happened here. Think Pike just vanished or ran off. Can't imagine that someone like me could plan and execute what I done. Their blindness is our protection. Their inability to see us as thinking beings with memory and intelligence and capacity for strategic violence. Long as they see us as children or animals, they'll never guard against the threats we actually pose. The psychological warfare was perhaps more significant than the actual violence. Every plantation owner in Louisiana now went to bed wondering whether their overseer might disappear, Whether their slaves were planning rebellion disguised as agricultural accidents, whether the system they depended on was sustainable when it required constant vigilance against workforce that outnumbered them 10 to 1. The comfortable assumption of natural hierarchy and inevitable submission had been shattered, replaced by awareness that enslaved people possessed both motivation and capability for organized resistance. By December 1852, the effects of Pike's death had spread far beyond Blackwater Estate's boundaries. The story had become legend, inspiration for those planning their own acts of resistance, and warning for those who believed their position granted immunity from consequences. Talise continued her kitchen duties, feeding the household and maintaining equipment with the same competence she'd shown before becoming killer and revolutionary symbol. The dogs in the kennel had never returned to their previous temperament, remaining aggressive and unpredictable despite efforts to retrain them through methods that had worked with previous generations of hunting animals. Some whispered that they'd been corrupted by consuming human flesh, that they now carried Pike's cruelty in their blood and couldn't be trusted around anyone. Others suggested more practical explanation. The dogs had simply learned that humans could be prey, and that knowledge couldn't be erased through discipline or kindness. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.